Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As the war in Ukraine continues, the cyber war that has accompanied it has not gone away. There is a global information war as well, and with it, questions about how to handle disinformation, speech and content moderation, and more. Our guest today is Dr. Courtney Radsch. She is a fellow at the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy at UCLA and a senior fellow at the Center of International Governance Innovation. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I guess my first question is, what have you observed in terms of Russian cyber activity and online propaganda?
Well, it started far before the actual invasion started, but it has certainly been a fundamental part of Russia's Russia's warfare strategy. Information warfare is central to their approach to offensive and defensive operations, and we've heard that for many years. So they have been very adept at leveraging Western social media platforms and openness to promote and propagate their propaganda.
Obviously, this is nothing new. You just stated that. I mean, propaganda has been around, since warfare, which is forever. So that's nothing new. But of course, the platforms that are being utilized is relatively new. And that's the thing that you're studying, right?
Yes, that's right. But what isn't new is Russia's use of these platforms to propagate propaganda and disinformation. I mean, obviously, everyone knows about what happened in 2016 with respect to Brexit, Donald Trump, all of that, not to mention the Philippines and Duterte's election. But basically, since then, we know that Russia has poured a lot of money into, for example, the Russian Internet Agency, posting and amplifying and trying to game the algorithms, bot farms, et cetera, as well as being very strategic in how it used its media platforms, RT, Sputnik, RIA, many other platforms, and creating really good presence online. We saw that RT was the second most popular outlet in the Middle East in Arabic. It's a very popular outlet in Spanish on YouTube. So they have been doing this for many years, not just using these platforms during the war.
Good point. What sort of narratives is Russia trying to promote right now?
Well, it is definitely trying to promote its idea of Nazism, of a whole different alternative reality to what's happening in Ukraine, about its justification for its illegal aggression. And, part of its whole approach is to question everything, to undermine the idea that there is a truth, that there is any sort of, actual fact out there. And to do that by asking questions, by, making false equivalencies, by bringing in dubious experts, but also by leveraging the reputations of established journalists who they have in the past been able to recruit to work for RT and other state, media outlets.
Sorry, RT is Russia Times. Is that what it's called?
So RT is now RT. It used to stand for Russia Today, but I think a lot of people who see RT on their television or social media feed don't want to watch something that is called Russia Today, so they rebranded as RT.
Okay, okay, and so they've been using that television network really as one of the pressure points for their propaganda.
Right. And then they have, that television network then has social media properties on all of the major platforms, and they were very popular. Mm-hmm. They have millions of viewers around the world, and they publish in multiple languages. So, I think a lot of the response to the propaganda has been very focused on Europe and on the US. But the fact that these sort of outlets are still very popular in the Middle East and Latin America is going to have an influence on global public opinion and might help explain why there isn't the support around the world for American and European approaches to the war.
Thank you for that. We're going to continue with our conversation with Dr. Courtney Radsch. We're going to take a brief break, but obviously lots to continue to dig into. So please stay with us. We'll be right back. Courtney, one of the things you mentioned in one of your writings is that the Russian use of humor as a way to also expand, I guess, the viewership of what they're trying to promulgate. Can you dig into that a little bit for us?
Sure. So Russia has had a really dedicated strategy of building up its presence on social media, gaining an audience. A lot of that is not through promoting hard news or the Russian perspective on the news of the day. It's about entertaining audiences. It's about getting new followers through the use of humor, through interesting little stories. There was this group called Mafic Media that there are alleged ties to Russia. It got a state media label on Facebook, and it protested, saying that it wasn't Russian. We don't know. I'm not going to get into that, but
Right.
essentially, a lot of the reporting showed that it was, and it basically focused on like feel good human interest stories, things that are designed to go viral on social media platforms. And so what that allowed Russia, these Russian media properties to do is to build audience, to, get more followers. And then that is primed for translating other information to those audiences.
Are they using TikTok as a medium as well? Is that one of the sites you've studied?
There are a lot, I think especially now, there are a lot of Russian, pro-Russian accounts on TikTok. So TikTok, I think, was pretty unprepared, oddly, for what happened in Russia because it did not have a public state media policy. It was not publicized, rather. And so they weren't, I think, prepared or at least publicly describing how they were dealing with state media or with state affiliated accounts. They then put on some restrictions about how people could share from inside Russia and Ukraine, trying to, I think, combat disinformation. But what actually happened is that we saw then the prevalence of Russian points of view on TikTok. And so I think the problem is if you're using any of these platforms to try to get a version of reality, it's going to be skewed by whatever the content moderation and terms of service of those particular platforms are.
And I guess that's my next question. It sounds like it's prevalent everywhere, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, I'm presuming Twitter as well, with the bots and so on. So there's really no place that is immune from this. Is that right?
Well, if this is kind of the use of these platforms for propaganda campaigns, then certainly not. We have seen some efforts to restrict access to amplification, recommendation systems, monetization, and advertising to Russian state-affiliated accounts on most of the platforms. But in some cases, this is not taking place globally. It's maybe just, focused on the European and US region.
Right.
In other cases, it has been rolled out globally. But nonetheless, it's really applying primarily to the content from those state-based actors or state-aligned actors. But the fact is that lots of normal people also see that content. And we have to remember that it's not just about Russia. I mean, we saw that Fox News, for example, a couple of the hosts, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, were, also giving kind of the same talking points that Russian media were giving for a while. And so that filters through the information ecosystem. It's not just about Russia, putting stuff out there and then trying to, get that point of view to dominate. It's also part of this broader media ecosystem that includes the mainstream media, and that includes kind of counter-establishment media as well.
So how do you, and I'm asking this truthfully here, how do you distinguish between a point of view that is genuinely held by a US or a Canadian host, let's say, versus what could be considered Russian propaganda? How do we draw the line there?
I mean, I think You can only draw the line by looking at who is the instigating account. Like, you can't force people not to have opinions that are pro-Russian. There is still, thankfully, freedom of thought in the world, as pernicious as that may be. But I think that you can look at what to do to stop state-aligned accounts and agencies from leveraging the properties and design of these social media platforms to amplify and elevate their propaganda. There's no reason that RT should have been able to earn millions of dollars on Facebook through monetization. And, I've had discussions with Facebook, and they say, well, if we block, because I've asked why allow state aligned media at all to monetize on your platform? And they're like, well, that might hurt, so-called good media. Well, maybe we just shouldn't, if it's a state aligned media, just doesn't need to monetize at all.
We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Courtney, please continue with your comment.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that social media companies need to consider is whether the state accounts in countries that censor their platforms for their citizens should be allowed to have accounts on those platforms. Facebook, Twitter, TikTok are censored in several countries, China, Iran, North Korea, yet their leaders and state accounts, embassies, et cetera, are allowed to have official accounts on those platforms, which means that it's a one-way propaganda outlet out, whereas we're not able to get alternative perspectives from citizens on, who are in those countries. And I think that is something that really needs to be considered, because why should these countries be allowed to propagate propaganda on these open platforms?
You've said that some of these content moderation policies on social media are kind of done seat of the pants or on the fly. Is that still the case, or is it starting to be systematically looked at right now?
So I think there are some policies that are more systematically addressed. For example, around content moderation, a platform now is expected to have content moderation rules that are publicly available that describe how they deal with legal content, illegal content, harassment, hate speech, et cetera. But what they're not, being proactive about is what they're going to do in conflict situations, about how they're going to deal with state media, about how they're going to deal with weaponized propaganda, what this means for monetization, how they're going to address the transfer of accounts during an undemocratic coup or a takeover. These are things that they know they need to address, because we saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Myanmar, when the military junta took over there, when the Taliban took over. What happened to those accounts? Why are these social media companies only creating rules for the United States and like official transfer of the White House account? They need to do that in every country. That should be a basic policy that every company has.
I'm going to return to this issue. Obviously, it's very topical of content moderation. But first, just to finish the story a little bit between Russia and Ukraine, what are the Ukrainians doing to tell their narrative and to contrast or combat Russian propaganda?
Well, a few things. So definitely we've seen really creative uses of social media, especially TikTok. We've also seen that the companies have recognized that they need to encourage and help good information to rise above all of the kind of disinformation that's swirling about. And so the independent media in Ukraine have gotten together and worked with international partners to create lists of trustworthy media outlets that Facebook, Twitter, other companies can use to protect those accounts, so that they're known that, hey, these are actually legitimate independent news sites. And you've seen average citizens using the power of these platforms to show their resistance, their resilience, and their creativity. I mean, I just love that video of the old lady standing up to the soldier. And, I think those sort of powerful images are the things that are really resonating with people around the world and show the power of social media to provide alternative perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point. And before the conflict started in earnest, a lot of predictions were that the Russian bot machine and other things were going to sort of overpower everything. But really, from at least from a North American and probably European perspective, the Ukrainians have more than they've showed that they can match or even exceed the Russian propaganda machine. Is that your conclusion as well?
Well, I think it's different because you have a lot of, I mean, certainly there is a concerted effort in Ukraine to counteract Russian disinformation, but you just also have, I think, the organic,
Hmm.
use of social media by average Ukrainians who are trying to show what it's like to live in the midst of a hot war in Europe in, the middle of the 21st century. So I think that is probably more powerful than the organized information efforts by Ukraine or Ukrainian government. And I think we've seen that around the world, in many conflicts, that it is the people on the ground, the organic efforts to show the reality that really ends up resonating with people around the world.
We're going to continue our discussion with Dr. Courtney Radsch. She is going to join us for the final segment. That'll start in just a few seconds. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Courtney Radsch. We're talking about mostly Russian disinformation and propaganda campaigns. But since we're on the topic, Courtney, President Biden has recently announced a disinformation governance board. Good idea, bad idea? Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's a good idea to bring in outside experts to try to help the government figure out how to address disinformation. I think it's a bad idea to do that in the Department of Homeland Security and to do it in a way that has been really less than transparent and has not, really responded to reporters' requests for greater information, which is an important part of the equation of how you combat disinformation, making sure you provide good information.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, that's created the story, hasn't it? Rather than the intention to combat disinformation. Is government any good at regulating against disinformation versus legitimate free speech? Is this something that government can do well?
So far, there's very little evidence that it has done it well, but I think that there is potential to do it well if they get at some of the root causes. And so instead of trying to regulate, the expressive intent that can be done online, I think we need to look at more foundational aspects like data transparency and access to data so that people can understand how things flow through the system, how disinformation gets amplified, what role these different platforms play in that process. You can look at mandated transparency for advertising of all kinds, not just during elections, restrictions potentially on foreign advertisers, or again, making sure you have transparency and that sort of information is available to researchers and others who want to use it to understand what's happening. I think you can also look at things like, data portability so that you're not stuck on any one platform. So there are a lot of different types of things that can be done, as well as I think opening up the can of worms that is Section 230, but really rethinking what this idea of intermediary liability means when it comes to user-generated content and how you can, say, mitigate against the weaponization and monetization of that.
Well, since I've got you on the program, of course, the big story for the last few weeks, at least, has been Elon Musk and his takeover bid for Twitter. Is that another threat, or is he a free speech hero? How should we process this?
I mean, he's neither. He's a very wealthy billionaire who has already colonized vast swaths of the public sphere, including the night sky, large swaths of space, potentially our minds with Neuralink. So I think we need to look at this for what it is, which is another billionaire, rich white dude wants to buy up a very important part of the public sphere. Now, he wants to be a free speech maximalist, but at the same time, he said he's going to comply with laws. Those things are at odds because most laws around the world are not as permissive for free speech as American laws are, and they don't have the same protection from intermediary liability. So I think he's going to come up against a reality check. And also, most people don't want to swim in the cesspool that is Twitter without content moderation. It's already very problematic when it comes to online harassment, hate speech, et cetera.
Right.
So lifting some of those is just going to be more difficult.
Yeah, and I guess Europe is actually tightening up its content moderation requirements, right?
Yes. So the Digital Services Act mandates certain types of content moderation. And so if Twitter and Musk want to stay in Europe, it's going to have to comply. And there are at least 24 countries around the world, according to Freedom House, that have content moderation related laws that mandate when you can do content moderation, how you can do it, when you have to take down illegal content or leave up content. And so, he's going to come up against the reality check that is there is a patchwork of international legislation that Twitter is going to have to figure out how to comply with or when to disregard. And that's going to have, of course, economic and political implications.
It's going to be an ongoing story. I don't think we've heard the last of this, and certainly nothing is set in stone yet. But Courtney Radsch, thank you for joining us today. Very interesting conversation, and one that I think is going to be around for a little while. I don't think there's immediate solutions on either the Russian front or indeed domestically. But thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It was my pleasure.
For sure. Interesting conversation with Dr. Courtney Radsch. Obviously, a whole series of issues about propaganda, misinformation, and then the other side of it is the content moderation. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Lots to be said about this. We'll continue to examine it on this program. Thanks for watching today.